goes towards marine reserves ecological monitoring work. And about half that $260,000 goes to contracting with local commercial and charter fishing vessels to assist us in that ecological monitoring work. About $115,000 per biennium goes towards supporting human dimensions research, and a little over $100,000 goes towards outreach and community engagement work. And then we also provide some funding each biennium to Oregon State Police to help support enforcement of the reserve sites. So just to share with you what a busy year we had in 2017, wanted to share with you some of the program highlights. This year we worked in collaboration with 34 people in different ecological, social, and economic research and monitoring work. We provided close to $12,000 to local communities, supporting local community-based projects or programs. So these are projects or programs that complement or support marine reserves implementation. So they might be developing outreach materials, they might be hosting local events, or they might include citizen science projects. We awarded $10,000 in scholarships to students engaged in marine reserves related research. And our 6 staff have given over 16 presentations this year. These were presentations at scientific meetings, at workshops, or at local community events. We met twice this year with the Scientific Technical Advisory Committee, that's staff, and Shelby will actually be giving an update from our most recent staff meeting last week. The intent of working with staff this year was to start planning for that 2023 program evaluation. So we're going to be working with staff closely over this biennium to determine what sort of syntheses our program needs to be developing and generating to hand over for that program evaluation in 2023. We also this year completed the management plan for the Cascade Head site, so that is now available. For the human dimensions research, we had 8 studies in progress this year. Some of the new studies we embarked on this year included 2 fishing effort shift studies, a student who was doing a research project around traditional ecological knowledge by tribes around marine reserve sites, as well as resident attitudes and values of ecosystem services and how they may or may not be provided by marine reserve sites. On the ecological monitoring front, we had 12 research projects in progress this year. We conducted work at 4 marine reserve sites. And part of this year, we were able to complete 4 pilot studies. So those are now wrapped up. We conducted hook and line surveys at 2 of the reserve sites this year. We did scuba surveys at 3 marine reserve sites this year. We conducted remotely operated vehicle video surveys at the Cascade Head site this year. Oregon State University continued their long-term monitoring project of juvenile fish at both the Otter Rock and Redfish Rock sites. We are still looking to try to expand this project to other reserves, but we are having a hard time coming up with funding to do that. Dr. Francis Chan at Oregon State University also did his 2nd year of data collection for ocean acidification at the reserve sites in rocky intertidal areas. So we're excited that that seems to be an ongoing project. And if you're interested, Surfrider Foundation, who's been helping recruit volunteers to assist in this research, actually has done a really nice storyboard that they posted on the website about this research and also about the just Oregon ocean acidification story. So I'd encourage you to check that out. The Nature Conservancy and ODFW has been continuing sea star wasting recovery monitoring at several of the marine reserve sites in rocky intertidal areas. We completed our stereo video pilot study. This is stereo camera system, so using 2 cameras for both our scuba surveys and with our video lander. The idea is we think stereo video might be able to get us more accurate fish lengths than we've been getting over the last several years. So that data has been collected and we're crunching the numbers now and writing a report on that. And then we collaborated with the University of Oregon, Dr. Aaron Galloway, who did a lean cod diet pilot study. So that data collection wrapped up this year, and he's now crunching those numbers. We had 4 vessel contracts with commercial and charter fishing vessels this year, totaling about $70,000. And we were very happy to get another scientific journal publication under our belt this year. This publication had to do with comparing long line gear to hook and line gear for sampling, and it was recently published in the Marine and Coastal Fisheries Scientific Journal. This study is part of our tailoring our ecological monitoring methods to the unique features of each of our marine reserve sites. And in this instance, this study was looking at whether or not we were adequately sampling fish species that are regularly caught in the local fishery in and around the redfish rocks in Port Orford area. Our concern was that we were undersampling species that are regularly caught in that fishery, particularly those fish species that don't move around a whole lot, and that have received very regular or heavy fishing pressure because of the redfish rocks site, the way that reserve is designed in place. Those are the species more likely to be benefited from reserve protections and are more likely to show an ecological response. And so we need to make sure we are adequately sampling those fish species. Jeff Miles, who is a local fisherman out of Port Orford, suggested to us, or recommended to us, that we try modifying commercial longline gear to see if we might be able to use that in our sampling, to get at some of those fish species that we are not adequately sampling. So Jeff was a major collaborator with us on this project. Just for a little background, we conduct hook and line surveys at 4 of our marine reserve sites. We do the surveys both in the marine reserve as well as outside the marine reserve in areas that are still open to fishing. And we are targeting fish species that are closely affiliated with rocky reef habitat. We really like hook and line surveys because for each fish we catch, we're able to identify it to the species. That's not always the case with some of our underwater visual surveys, such as SCUBA and ROV, where sometimes we're not able to identify fish to species. We also like hook and line because they get very accurate fish lengths. And that's important because fish lengths are one of the early potential indicators of a marine reserve response. If we might be seeing larger average size of fish inside the reserve versus outside of the reserve first. So in our hook and line surveys that we've been conducting at Redfish Rocks, this is pretty typical of the species that we were catching and the proportion of catch of each of those species. So this was for 2014, but this was pretty typical. The majority of the fish we were catching were black rockfish, as well as ling cod. The problem was we're not catching as many of those solitary demersal fish species in our catch, and those are some of the species we think will more likely benefit from marine reserve protections at the Redfish Rock site. So, as I mentioned, we also were concerned that we weren't catching species that were regularly being caught in the local fishery at Port Orford. Port Orford is unique in that there's very little sport fishing that occurs in and around Port Orford and previously in the Redfish Rock site. It's predominantly commercial fishing, and the nearshore groundfish fishery, the landings from that fishery, actually 1/3 of those landings come from the use of longline gear. And in the nearshore groundfish fishery, the species catch is dominated by 10 species. So we looked at our hook and line surveys that we've been conducting from 2010 to 2014, and we compared it to the local nearshore groundfish fishery. So on the far right are the species we were catching in our hook and line sampling at Redfish Rocks using hook and line gear. And then in the middle is the species being caught and the proportion being caught by commercial hook and line gear. And on the far left is species being caught using commercial long line gear in the local fishery. So you'll notice for black rockfish, on the far right, our catch looks pretty similar proportionally to what's being caught in the commercial fishery by commercial hook and line gear. But you'll notice on the far left, long line gear isn't catching that many of black rockfish. And conversely, cabezon on the far left is a pretty significant portion of the catch in the long line gear. We seem to be undersampling it in our hook and line surveys. Similarly with China rockfish and similarly with vermilion rockfish, we seem to be undersampling. So we embarked in a study to compare a modified commercial long line gear and comparing it to our hook and line gear to see if we could get at some of these species more. So we wanted to know between the two gear types, was there differences in catch composition? And were there differences in catch rates, particularly for these 6 species. We were interested in if we could get better data on these fish. We wanted to also know if the gear types were sampling similar sizes of fish. We wanted to know if there were any different cost differences between a long line survey and a hook and line survey. And we also wanted to know about injury and mortality rates with the long line versus the hook and line gear. So we did our sampling in 2015 and 2016. We contracted with Jeff Miles, and we simultaneously did long lining while hook and line sampling. So while our long lines were soaking, we were also using hook and line gear to catch and sample fish. So some of our data showed that certain gears caught more of certain species. So the hook and line gear caught more of black rockfish and kelp greenling, and that catch was significantly greater. But for all the other species, long line gear was catching more of those species. And for cabezon, copper rockfish, and vermilion rockfish, which are 3 of our species of particular interest, that difference was statistically significant. So long line better at catch rates than hook and line for some of these species we're interested in. We looked at gear selectivity. So these species on the left were better at being using the long line gear. Black rockfish, lingcod, and kelp greenling were better at being targeted by the hook and line gear. We also found that the long line gear was getting us bigger fish compared to the hook and line gear. We compared costs and effort, and the long line surveys compared to our typical hook and line surveys required slightly less manpower and was slightly cheaper. We had injury rates of 3% and mortality rates of 3% using the long line gear, but those were limited to 3 species: black rockfish, canary rockfish, and blue/deacon rockfish. Interestingly, we found that the hook and line gear actually, for certain rockfish species, was more apt to show signs of barotrauma with certain fish than the long line gear. Less barotrauma symptoms with the long line gear. These mortality and injury rates with the long line gear we still viewed as being quite minimal and acceptable. So results, we did see differences in catch composition between the 2 gear types. The long line gear was better at catching these species of particular interest that we're interested in doing a better job sampling. We were able to actually catch larger fish with the long line gear. Costs between the 2 surveys were very comparable, and there were some differences in injury and mortality rates, but the rates were considered acceptable. So in conclusion, we have now moved to supplementing our hook and line surveys at Redfish Rocks with long line. The idea is we can get more at those species we're particularly interested in. We're actually able to broaden the size range of fishes that we're collecting data on. And by having this long line component now, we're able to look at marine reserve effects at the local level, but we didn't want to completely ditch our hook and line sampling because we use that same sampling method at 3 of our other reserve sites. Plus, California is using a comparable method to monitor their NPAs, and Washington has also recently adopted some similar hook and line surveys. So the idea is we now have these West Coast-wide data sets that we can be looking at more regional marine reserve effect analyses, as well as we might be able to be feeding more into regional fisheries management, providing data for more fisheries management purposes. This paper is posted on our website in our resource library. I did bring a few copies if anyone wanted to take a hard copy home to read. And I also have just a handout with, again, highlighting our program accomplishments from this year to pass out to folks. And if there's time, I can take questions.
Kristen, again, thank you for your presentation. Congratulations on your publication. It's always hard to do. Are there any questions?
Yes.
Really, I'm gonna sit back down.
Kristen, what month of the year did you do your surveys?
It depends what, you mean the long line, hook and line?
Yeah, the one you did comparison.
So that pilot was just in the springtime, so it was starting in March, going through early June typically. But our hook and line surveys we do in the spring and in the fall.
Well, the ocean changes in the winter. It's just gone through that period. And it'd be interesting to see if you couldn't find a good weather window to make sure that the catch ratios stay the same in different periods of the year, especially later into the winter when blue rock and deacon rock show up in the grounds, and so that we really had an accurate picture that it's what really goes on year round. Because I know that fish change their attitude at different times of the year, and we're seeing that right now. One of those major changes. So it's a possibility if you can find funding. I'd like to, if you get a chance, to make good science to have a better year-round picture than just some of the places.
Warren?
First, I wanted to thank you for using an old picture of me.
I was thinking about taking that picture back and showing the fleet.
Two questions. What is the recovery like for the starfish wasting syndrome? Do you have any data on that as to how they're coming along?
Well, there are certainly people, probably even in this room, that can speak to that better than I can, but the data, some of the data we've been collecting in the Nature Conservancy and that I've seen from Oregon State University and UC Santa Cruz, there have been signs, at least intertidally, of the small juveniles showing up in some pretty big numbers at some of the sites. So it looks like there was perhaps a recruitment pulse, but now we need to see if those juveniles are able to make it into adulthood, basically. Now, Dave?
Yeah, that's accurate. That's pretty much the finding in the intertidal. So far, there's these, like you said, pulses of small ones, but we have to wait a while to see if they survive or not. We're also not really seeing much change in the subtidal. We saw a big decrease offshore in most sea star species. And unfortunately, our methods of video, you can't really detect and identify the small ones. So we're going to probably have to wait a while before we confirm we start seeing big ones again.
Thank you. The other question I had was what kind of length of soak time are you using for the long leader gear?
Oh, the long line here?
Yeah, yeah. I have long leader on the brain.
I can't remember. I want to say, I think it was 20 minutes, but it's in the paper. I can't remember right now what the...
So not really a very long time.
It's shorter than what the commercial guys typically set. We did shorten the amount of
You're
soap.
probably using a shorter soap to decrease mortality, I presume.
Yes.
That kind of answers the next question in and of itself. I had the thought that perhaps you could utilize the long line gear in winter months where you could put it out and have it soaking for a longer period of time and not have to be out there with it. But you'd probably have too much mortality and make that practical.
Mortality goes way up.
Chris?
Kristen, I was wondering if you could summarize the law enforcement activity that you've seen at the reserves at this point, and know if they're still out there doing much interaction with folks, or if the existence of the reserves at this point and their boundaries are pretty well known by folks.
Yeah, so Oregon State Police does actively monitor the sites. They have, and they keep records of how frequently they are terrestrially, looking out at the sites and recording if they're sending their boat out at any time. So we have that data. There have been violations at all the sites. There seems to have been a trend that more violations occurred at first, and they have been maybe trailing off. We'll see if that pattern holds or not. Laurel from State Parks and I meet with Oregon State Police twice a year to go over compliance and enforcement, to see what the trends are, if we're having any issues at any of the sites, if we need to be doing more outreach. And the other thing that Oregon State Police started, they did a pilot, was it starting last year, or was it this year? The cameras?
Last year.
I think last year. At 2 of the Marine Reserve sites, they're piloting the use of cameras to see if they can detect, when they might need to send a boat or a trooper out. So they're piloting to see how good of a tool for enforcement that is. Okay.
Well, from a guy who fishes next to one, flat calm day in August on a Sunday afternoon, you'll get a violator. It seems like, on the weekends, where people just are naive of it, we have to stop somebody once in a while. I think it's getting better.
Okay.
Last year, there was one that the charter boat chased around up at a depot bay that didn't seem to want to stop, but most of them, you walk up to them and just tell them they're in a Marine Reserve, or when you run up to them, they're more than happy to leave. They're just ignorant of it.
Right.
But it's usually on a flat calm day in August, or July. It doesn't, seems to be on the weekends more than during the week.
So we're gonna do Charlie, then Lauren, and then we're gonna move to our next person.
Kristen, I know that the goals for Oregon's Marine Reserves were not directly linked to fisheries, but I'm curious if, given the type of information you guys are collecting, are you able to work with stock assessors at all about linking the data that you're collecting to potentially some assessments for species here in Oregon?
Great question. We just, within the last year, have started to have discussions with several folks who work on federal stock assessments at NOAA. So they are looking at our data to see, even if it doesn't feed directly into the stock assessment, there might be other ways for it to inform the model. And it's not just the hook and line or long line here. They're also interested potentially in the juvenile fish recruitment research we're doing and some of the dietary studies we're doing. So that will be an ongoing discussion, and we're starting to work a little bit more closely with our fisheries management team at ODFW, again, to see if or where we might be using the data we're already collecting, or if there's ways we could easily tweak the data we're collecting to be more useful to support fisheries management. Karin, add more to that.
May I? Sure, thank you. So just to add to that, there is an agenda item at the November council meeting for those of you who are in the council process. Anybody can look at it. That is a specific request from ODFW to have some of our remotely operated vehicle or ROV data reviewed by the council's Science and Statistical Committee, which is somewhat of a gateway to including some of that data in federal stock assessment. So it's marine reserves data, it's our habitat and species data. We're trying to funnel all of the relevant information that we have into that stock assessment process because it's so important that they are well informed if they're going to both allow us fisheries, but also sometimes more concerningly constrain our fisheries, which they have been recently. So.
Actually, Lauren.
I wanted to thank Charlie for asking my question very eloquently, and concur with Terry that enforcement from the charter fleet, anytime we see anyone where they shouldn't be, we attempt to educate them a little bit, and if they resist attempts at education, then we know who to call.
Helpers on the seat. David?
Chris, I'm not sure if you were here earlier, but during public comment, someone asked a question regarding the Cape Falcon management plan and the status of that, and I mentioned that perhaps you would have some idea of what the process is for putting that in place, since there was some interest earlier on that particular issue.
Sure, so, we're currently working on drafting the Cape Perpetua site management plan, so that's, because we already have one for Redfish Rocks, we have one for Otter, and now we have the one for Cascade Head. We've already done the public workshops. We did those actually several years ago for Cape Perpetua, and other priorities unfortunately took precedent. But we should be wrapping that up, the Cape Perpetua one, at least have a draft out by the springtime. And then next year we will embark on the public process to get public input for the Cape Falcon site. And I haven't penciled out when an actual draft would be due. I'm hoping by the end of the year, but we will see if that's realistic or not. But definitely the public process to get public input will be, for Cape Falcon, will be next year.
Next year?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Is it really pressing?
No, not too later. Thank you.
I'll be around, sorry.
Thanks, Kristen.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. So our next presenter is Shelby. Do you want to stay where you are or go to the?
Unless people need me to move, I'll stay right here.
She's going to provide an update on staff.
Right. All right, while Andy gets that set up, for those of you who are new, I am currently the chair of the Science and Technical Advisory Committee, which Kristen mentioned previously. So this is a working group under OPAC. The group has been on, let's call it a hiatus for a while, years in fact, until earlier this year when ODFW and STAG got together for basically a 5-year assessment or check-in for the marine reserves process. Because we are approaching the marine reserves assessment, I anticipate that staff will be gearing up and you will be hearing from me on a more regular basis. What Kristen also noted was staff met last week, and so I wanted to give you guys an update about what we were talking about. A few things came up. I'm just going to be showing you a couple things on the screen. This was the agenda for the meeting. It was primarily focused on the marine reserves evaluation, and I can make that bigger. Let's see. But a few other things were added in response to the legislation that came out earlier this year with respect to the establishment of the Oregon Coordinating Council on Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia. There is a request for membership for one member representing the academic research community with relevant expertise appointed by the Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee to OPAC. So, we did have that discussion, and coming out of that, OPAC or STAG recommended that Dr. Aaron work focused on the Marine Reserves evaluation. Part of it was process, and then part of the conversation really focused on the human dimensions side. And these conversations were really spawned because of a lot of discussion, concern, sort of, oh my God, feeling that came out of the check-in that we had back in April with ODFW with respect to the assessment. So one of the things that I want to show you.
Shelby, can you speak up just a little bit?
Is our charge. So for those of you who are familiar, or if you're not familiar, the assessment process for the Marine Reserves is highlighted in Senate Bill 1510. And when I say highlighted, I mean more like mentioned, and very much in brief. So a couple things are highlighted here. The Science and Technical Advisory Committee shall, and there are some phasings with a draft report and final report, basically look at the establishment, study, monitoring, evaluation, and enforcement of the pilot marine reserves, marine protected areas, and seabird protection area. And so it is not STAC who will be doing the assessment. It is in fact a chosen public university that is selected by STAC that will be doing the assessment, and that will include an assessment of social, economic, and environmental factors related to the reserves and protected areas, recommendations for administrative actions and legislative proposals related to the reserves and protected areas, and basically any other scientifically based information. And that's it. That's all we got. That's pretty much all we have to go on in terms of the assessment. And if you can imagine a bunch of scientists sitting around the room, that caused a lot of consternation. So, what
Shelley,
is,
that was what the legislature gives other people.
Yeah.
I mean, you should be grateful. That's actually more specific than most stuff I read. See?
So, part of what we are then trying to do is, all right, this is the charge that we have from the legislation. How do we turn that into an actually tangible and rigorous process and assessment? So we had a lot of discussion about what do we think about criteria? How do we put this into an RFP? How do we think about the chosen university? What is the role of the chosen university? How prescriptive should STAC be? What is the engagement process of STAC in this process? There are a whole variety of things that are being considered at this point. So I am actually very happy with what we came out of the discussion on last Thursday, which was essentially a starting place for the development of criteria for the Marine Reserves. And the criteria, I'm happy to say, is based on work that this body did. So the OPAC Recommendations came out in 2008. They included a goal, objectives, and implementation principles and guidelines. So being able to look at the objectives as well as the implementation principles and guidelines is going to ideally give STAC the fodder it needs to develop criteria for both the process of the Marine Reserves as well as the impact of the Marine Reserves to ultimately get to this assessment of social, economic, and environmental factors related to Marine Reserves. So yes, starting place. And one of the things that I prefaced our meeting last Thursday was I do not expect us to have all of the answers coming out of this one meeting, which is why you're going to be hearing from us more because we're going to be meeting more. And that, as I mentioned, gave us the starting point for the criteria. that then needs to roll into the RFP, the whole process, the engagement of staff. We had some discussion about timelines. If you think about 2023 for delivering the final report, you think that's a really far time off. It's really not. And so being able to back away from the 2023 final report to when the draft needs to go in, to when staff needs to sign off on it, to when we need to engage with the chosen university, and perhaps most critically, the amount of time that ODF&W is going to need to put together the actual synthesis for this assessment. Because one of the other complicating factors is there are no additional appropriated dollars to support this process. Not for staff, not for the chosen university. And so how can we develop a rigorous process that can operate within that set of constraints? So ODF&W will likely be putting together this synthesis of the marine reserves, which will then be evaluated by the chosen university, which staff will then review and then submit to the state legislature, first in draft and then in final form. So that's kind of what came out of Thursday. A starting point for the criteria. The other piece of the meeting was focusing on the human dimensions component of marine reserves. What we heard in the check-in with ODF&W back in February was a lot of great information, but a very sort of broad brush. And one of the concerns that we had was, is this going to answer the question with respect to avoiding adverse impact of the marine reserves? And so coming out of that, we offered some suggestions to ODF&W about how they could perhaps focus some of the efforts with respect to the human dimensions piece, social, economic, cultural, and essentially come back to staff with a little bit more of a targeted approach. So we had said, hey, can we see perhaps a list of these set of hypotheses, and then how you go about doing that, what is the data that is available, and what is the data that is needed. One of the things that we just heard from Kristen is ODF&W is not replete with resources. They don't have a ton of people to be able to dedicate to marine reserves. Right now, Tommy Swearingen is their human dimensions person. And so how can we best work with Tommy to help him focus his efforts as well as the collaboration with his research partners? Our next meeting will be in May, at which point we'll be focusing again on the human dimensions element, as well as focusing more on the ecological side of the house, and continuing to refine the process moving forward. And for those of you who don't know who actually sits on staff, I'm guessing that might be true for a lot of you. These staff consists of university faculty. We have two folks from the Oregon Institute of Marine Biology, Dr. Craig Young, who is essentially a benthic zoologist, and Dr. Jan Hodder, who is a marine ecologist. Two folks from Portland State University, Elise Granick, a marine ecologist, and Veronica Dujon, who is a sociologist, who is also currently detailed to the Higher Education Coordinating Committee. And from Oregon State University, we have Selena Happel, who is a fisheries ecologist, as well as the department head for the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife. Dr. Gil Sylvia and Dr. Bill Yeager, both of whom are economists, and currently joining us today, Dr. Jack Barth, who is a physical oceanographer. And I'm pretty sure that's it. That's where things stand with STAC. Again, I anticipate that STAC updates will become a more regular part of the agenda for OPAC. unlike the establishment of the marine reserves, in which OPAC played a very significant part, OPAC is actually not called out in the legislation for this anywhere. But I feel very strongly that it's important to make sure that this body stays apprised of what's going on, as well as other decision makers moving forward. And so keeping everyone up to speed with what the discussions are and where we're headed is something that I will plan on doing. So, questions?
Great, thank you for that update, Shelby. Chris?
Shelby, the draft report, the final report you mentioned that would go to the legislature, does it go to specific committees or is it going to the assembly as a whole?
The first one does go to a specific committee. The final, I think, goes to the full. And I don't have right off the top of my head which specific committee is the draft is going to, but I can find out.
Charlie?
Shelby, I attended the STAC meeting. I don't remember if this came up at the STAC meeting or maybe at a presentation that Lindsay, the ecological lead, presented, but there was a question about the capacity of ODF and W to do the synthesis and to continue the monitoring activities. And I have a very strong opinion about that. And I don't know if there's a place for that, but I'm curious if there was any resolution to that about whether or not ODF and W would stop monitoring activities to do the synthesis, or whether or not the monitoring activities would continue.
So that was not as explicitly discussed at this most recent meeting, but it was raised at our April meeting.
Okay.
When we first started talking about this timeline, Kristen, you can remind me, but essentially for ODF and W to have the capacity to do the synthesis, essentially they will have to redirect their effort to do that. And I believe pretty much cease everything else.
For about a year. It will probably take us a year to do it. So unless additional funds or staff.
All right. Now, you mentioned your next meeting was in mid-April,
It'll be sometime the week of March 12th,
March 12th. Totally missed that. Thanks.
which I don't know what the timing is of the next OPAC, but it's probably before next.
Yeah, and we'll talk about, that's our last agenda item today, so. Great, well, thank you for the update and for all the work of STAC. It was a good meeting last week. So you also helped put us back on schedule, I appreciate that. We're gonna be moving forward with our ocean acidification and hypoxia coordinating council presentation, which Jack Barth and Karen Brady will be providing.
It's been a while since I've been at this table. You look very imposing, all of you. So, for the record, I'm Karen Brady, ODFW, and I am the chair of OPAC's Ocean Acidification Working Group, Ad Hoc Work Group, maybe is the specific title. And so I am going to run through an update that I've given you. You have been emailed this update by Andy. I believe it's been handed out at least. And I have here with me Dr. Jack Barth, who Shelby already introduced. There are going to be 3 parts to this hour, and it might be shorter than an hour, and we may need the entire hour, but those 3 parts are the work group update, an update on ocean acidification science from Dr. Barth, and then the bulk of the hour will be dedicated to discussion about OPAC's authority to appoint a conservation organization representative on the new Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Council. So with no further ado, I wanted to remind all of you what the OPAC OA work group is, why we exist, and what we agreed on the role of this work group to be. I'm on the work group, Gina Carter, Terry Thompson, and Shelby Walker. And they didn't have the benefit to do anything other than review this quickly last week, but I heard no cries of despair on this update, so I assume that it reflected what we think has happened since our last OPAC meeting in April. But I will pause at the end of this update to take any additional updates from around the table if you have anything you'd like to add to the record. But in December 2015, as many of you remember, we had a strategic planning session and chose ocean acidification as one of the 4 issues that OPAC wanted to focus on. And so we developed this working group with 4 concepts in mind. One was to provide a public forum on ocean acidification issues. Another was to document the activities that are related to ocean acidification, particularly to Oregon activities and Oregon concerns. The third opportunity, or the third component, was that the work group would highlight opportunities for OPAC to comment on any of these issues or take action. And the fourth was for providing an opportunity for OPAC to comment on any policy, legislation, or research that was going on. So those were kind of the 4 areas of concern for OPAC. This is why we have gone through the effort of providing these updates for each OPAC meeting. So on this 2-page outlined document, there's a whole list of things that have happened that connect to Oregon, that connect to OPAC, that connect to ocean acidification. And I will go through these briefly for the sake of time. Happy to take any questions if I don't go over them in enough detail, or to talk to anybody afterwards. But in order to understand this list of activities, since we have new folks at the table, I just wanted to run through a couple of foundational pieces. One of which is that Oregon has been a member of a group called the Pacific Coast Collaborative since its inception in 2008. And this was a governor's level agreement among British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California to work on climate and energy issues in a collaborative manner across those jurisdictional lines. And there's nothing regulatory about it. It's an agreement to sit down together and discuss options, discuss ways to align actions and collaborate. Since about 2010, that group has also convened a working group or a subcommittee that's focused specifically on ocean acidification as part of the issues related to climate and energy. And since last year, I have been serving as the governor's representative for Oregon on that. So the PCC has been involved in ocean acidification for a number of years, and there are 2 pieces of that work. One of which is global coalition building to build awareness, understanding, and collaboration on ocean acidification issues. And the other piece is to really focus on science, understanding, knowledge, monitoring on the West Coast to understand how this is affecting West Coast resources. So with that kind of background, kind of global coalition and monitoring, there are several pieces in here that relate to that PCC agenda, and that are the monitoring and science piece in particular is a huge piece of what OPAC's interest is, and as scientists, what our interests are on the West Coast. So the first activity is the Ocean Conference, which occurred in June, and that was a conference held by the United Nations. So global coalition, global building of awareness, and it focused on the oceans entirely. It was on Sustainable Development Goal 14. There are multiple components of that SDG, or Sustainable Development Goal. 14.3 is about ocean acidification, and essentially this Pacific Coast Collaborative effort was the focus and the foundation of that whole discussion. The 4 jurisdictions, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California, have developed a group that is now no longer ours in terms of ownership. It is called the Ocean Acidification Alliance, and it's literally a thing unto itself that includes members who want to join that group and talk about the